Good morning. It is good to see everyone this morning. Glad to see visitors and members alike. We are always thankful to be able to gather together and to worship God together. I want to mention just real briefly, based on what was mentioned in the announcements, if you have not heard Rob Whitaker speak, he'll be the one speaking in Wheeler for the next couple of nights. If you've not heard him speak, you've not heard his material on evangelism and so forth, I would highly encourage you to go to that. I've had the opportunity to hear him a couple of different times and hear the presentation that he's going to be doing at Wheeler, at least in its basic elements, and it is phenomenal stuff. So very encouraging and very useful as well. If you get the chance, I would encourage you to be able to go there. We're going to be looking at an interesting topic this morning, and I feel the need to make a couple of disclaimers before we get into this topic. Number one, we're going to be talking about ministry. I do not in any way intend for this lesson to be focused or put a spotlight on me in any way as we're talking about ministry. Yes, I am in what some people would describe as the field of ministry, but that is not the purpose or the reason or the emphasis of what we're doing this morning in this lesson. And the other thing that I want to say is that anything that I say in the course of this lesson is not in response to anything that's happened. No one here has said anything that made me feel like I needed to cover this. This, in fact, is from a very different source that gave me the idea to do this lesson, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But I want to make those two clarifications very clear before we get into the lesson this morning. I was listening to a chapel talk. There will be like essentially a 30-minute devotional at the beginning of the day at the college that I'm currently taking classes at. And although as distance learners, we're not required to go to every single one of those, we do watch some of them online. And I was listening to a chapel talk the other day by one of my professors, and it struck a chord in an interesting way. And that's kind of what gave me the idea for our topic this morning. It was not a conventional lesson, you might say. It wasn't the direction I thought he was going to go. And honestly, I told Liz, at first, I didn't even think he was on topic. He had been assigned a topic, and I was like, he's not even going to cover what he's been assigned. What kind of speaker is this, right? But then he came back around to it in a very interesting way, and it gave me some ideas that I wanted to springboard off of this morning. We're going to be looking at this idea of being paid to minister, and this idea of ministry in general in the Lord's church. It is something that we have ideas about, I feel like. We have kind of this idea in our mind, even the statement, someone who is paid to minister. We have a very specific picture in our minds. Someone probably, again, not to put the spotlight on myself, but someone in a position like I am, presenting lessons and doing all these kinds of things, and getting a paycheck to do that as a part of the local congregation. That's usually the idea we have in our minds. But that is something that I think we could stand to consider in a little more depth and maybe change our perspectives just a little bit. And so if we're going to do that, I want us to start by simply asking a question. What is ministry? Now, sometimes, again, we think of ministry as the field of ministry, or think about someone as a minister, right? That's an office or a position or a job. But I would argue that's not actually the base idea of what ministry is. In fact, if you look up the word ministry, just in the average dictionary, you will find something along the lines of someone or the act of doing something that meets someone's need. That is the basic idea of ministry, looking to meet the needs of other people. In fact, if you look at the definition of mercy as it is originally defined, you would find a very similar definition. The two often go hand in hand. Ministry is simply the act of trying to help meet someone's needs. And so you then find, even in, I guess you could say, official positions, people who minister in a variety of different ways. Certainly, you'd have people in a pulpit preaching position who would be described as ministers, but you'd also have people who work, for example, as counselors with the church who do a counseling ministry, trying to meet needs in that way. You have people who are working in missions ministry, for example, trying to specifically apply their efforts towards the needs of people in foreign lands who are not only in need of the gospel, but in need of some of the necessities of life. Oftentimes, there's all sorts of different ways that we can define this, but this is how I want us to begin shifting our focus, not to someone behind a pulpit, but to the basic idea of ministry as meeting a need. Because when you think about it, that is something that all Christians are called to do, right? Paul tells Titus, let our people, talking about Christians, he's giving advice to someone who we would call, in the basic definition, a minister, but he says, let our people learn to devote themselves to good works, so as to help cases of urgent need and not be unfruitful. Notice, he's talking to a minister, but he's describing to this individual something that all Christians should be involved in, meeting the needs of others. Similarly, John is going to tell the people that he's writing to in the letter of 1 John, if anyone has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Now, both of these contexts seem specifically to be dealing with needs in kind of a physical sense, right? Food and clothing and shelter. And while we live in a very affluent society, a society that has a lot of the basic needs of life taken care of for the most part, we are also very familiar with the fact that not all countries, not all societies share those privileges, and many of the people in the society John's writing to, or Paul is writing to, don't have those privileges either. There was a very real need for the basic necessities of life, and John's having to write because sometimes Christians weren't willing to meet that need, weren't willing to minister in that sense. But it's not just the necessities of life that ministry involves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others, Paul says in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4. Now I want us to consider, what are the interests of others? That would include things like food and clothing and shelter, right? But I think the interests of others go a lot further than that, don't you? Again, going back to what we said about different kinds of ministries. There are people who, they have plenty of food, they have plenty of clothing, they have a good house, and maybe even a steady job, but there's something inside them, whether it's a mental issue, whether it's an emotional struggle that's tearing them apart, and they need someone to help them with that. There are some people who perhaps are struggling with just different aspects of temptation or perhaps addiction, and they need help with that. There are people who are simply lonely. And their interests are in every other way perhaps being met, but they need community, they need people, and they need someone to meet that need. And we're told in the letter to the Philippians, Paul says to the church there, you need to be caring, you need to be looking to, seeing about those interests, not just of yourself, not just taking care of what you need, what do others need as well? In Galatians, Paul is addressing a group of people that have disappointed him. Let's just put it like that. They are not living their lives in the way that Paul is encouraging them to, not in the sense that they are necessarily being unkind to one another, but in the sense that they have started down a path of going back to the teachings of the law and ignoring the teachings of Christ himself. And Paul is emphasizing this and the problems that go along with that. But notice how he wants to conclude as he begins the last chapter of his letter. Brothers, if any one of you is caught in any transgression, like, for example, what he's been addressing throughout his letter, You who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Who's he talking to? He's not talking to the preacher of the church of Galatia. He's not talking to the eldership of the church of Galatia. He's talking to the church in Galatia. Actually, the church is. There were multiple congregations of the Lord's people throughout the region of Galatia. And he's saying, those of you who are spiritually strong, you need to be helping those who are getting caught up in transgression. You need to be meeting a need that they may not even realize that they have, but you can see it because you understand what's right and what's wrong. Brother, ministry is not something that is confined to a specific job title or a specific form of activity or specific skill set. Ministry is something that we all are to be taking part in. Ministry is something that we all are to be involved in, not just it's good if we are, not just it's a positive thing, it's a good thing if we have the time. No, this is something every Christian is called to participate in. We are to all be ministers in a very real sense of meeting the needs of not only our brothers and sisters around us, but of those who we come in contact with in the world who more than anything need the gospel of Christ. But if that's the case, if that is what ministry is, I want us to think about the practical side of this for a second. Why are there ministry jobs then? If ministry is something all Christians should be doing, why do we describe certain jobs as ministers, as ministry positions? Why do we do that? And you might even think of it in this way. Is the church a business? After all, a job is something we think of in a business context, right? Unfortunately, there are some congregations of the Lord's church that kind of end up running themselves like a business. And I mean that in a sense of they've lost focus of their goal and they just want to run the whole thing solely as kind of a social business. But that being said, there is something that we can learn from that kind of structure. If you go to any given business, there is something that we see in terms of how different people are assigned to different roles. Are you going to ever go to any given business, unless it's maybe like one person running the business, right? If you're going to a business that has multiple employees, even multiple departments, does every one of them have the same job description? Well, no, there'd be no point, right? That would defeat the purpose. You have someone over here in accounting, you have someone over here in sales, you have someone over here in product development, someone over here in management, all these kinds of things. Now, in a healthy, functioning business, which one of those jobs can you eliminate and the business still runs smoothly? Well, if the business is designed as it should be, you can't eliminate any of them. They are all essential positions. Now, some of them might get paid more than others. Some of them might be more public than others. Some of them might be more respected than others. But all of them are essential. And while, again, I don't in any way agree with the overall idea that the church should be run as a business in any sense, there is something to be learned from that, because that idea of different roles all being essential is exactly what we see in Scripture of how the church itself is described. In fact, Paul goes into a great amount of detail about this in 1 Corinthians 12 in particular. He's talking to the Corinthians who are arguing over people in different positions, people in different, I think we could rightly say, aspects of ministry. This person is trying to minister in this way, this person is trying to minister in this way, and they're fighting over, well, I would rather do this than this, and I would rather do this. Well, this is a more important way to minister. I am more important because I minister in this way, and you just minister in this way. And Paul's saying, guys, you're missing the point. He says there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And specifically, he talks about spiritual gifts in a miraculous sense, which of course we don't have happening in the same sense today, but In terms of the principle of service, how does he describe it? The body, with many members, yet one body. Just like that physical entity that we each have using for, I guess you could say, our spirits to be housed in until we are able to escape this life. Just as this physical form functions with all these different members, and yet all of them are essential. You know, scientists used to have this whole list of what they called vestigial organs that don't do anything, that have no purpose. They're just supposedly left over from evolutionary process or something like that. You know, they found uses, very essential uses for every single one of those organs. Kind of ironic. The appendix, for example, used to be thought of as completely useless, and people take out their appendix just for the fun of it. And now we found out, well, yes, in adults it doesn't do as much, but it's a crucial part of the immune system of children. All sorts of examples like that. The point is, everything in our bodies is there for a reason. You mess with one, it's going to hurt the whole body in some way. So yes, we have quote-unquote ministry jobs, meaning specific roles that people fill within the church that are specific to a certain perhaps skill set sometimes, perhaps opportunity, or whatever the case might be. But in a healthy, functioning church, all of us are essential. All of us are ministers. Not all in exactly the same way, not all doing exactly the same thing. But we are all one in Christ. James says in James chapter 3 and verse 1, in fact, he says, few of you should be in a specific ministry role. That is the role of the teacher. Everyone should be in ministry, but there are only going to be certain people in certain roles of ministry. Why does he say that? He says, you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. Now, I find this passage interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, James is including himself. He says, we who teach. He's admitting, I am in this position, I am in this role. And he's not saying, I don't want anyone else to be in this role so that I can be special. No, he's saying, I'm going to be held to a greater level of responsibility because this is a role that is meeting a need, certainly. But it also has the potential to cause great harm if it is not done correctly. That's one reason this passage is interesting. The other reason is, as someone who does teach, this passage is terrifying. This passage is terrifying because it means I'm going to be held to a higher standard. That's not how should I say this? It doesn't feel like a compliment to me, right? Does it feel like, oh yes, I should feel better about myself. I should feel better than other people. No, this makes me almost sometimes wish that I didn't have that level of responsibility. We are all called to be ministers in the ways and according to the opportunities that we are given. And so we have specific roles set aside because of time, because of skill set, because of all these different things. But that's because each of us has something to contribute. Each of us has a part to play in the whole functioning together as it should. It's interesting when Paul is talking about this specifically in terms of payment. Those who are being supported to do specific ministry works. I think about not only those who are supported to do this in a local congregation. We support people, right, who are working on foreign fields in various ways, whether they are trying to minister to orphans, for example, whether they're trying to proclaim the gospel in more of a missionary setting. There's all sorts of people who are supported to do this. Why? Well, because some aspects of ministry take a lot of time, take a lot of effort. Notice what Paul says. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Now that last one might sound strange. I would argue he's talking about goats, because goat's milk was a very common thing in his culture. We don't usually think of a flock. We think of a herd if we're talking about goats. But nonetheless, what's his point? Paul is saying there are some who are working in areas of ministry that they need help. They need support because they're putting forth so much time and so much effort. They need to be able to provide, and they don't have a way of doing that without the support of others. Not because they're any better, not because they're superior in any way, but simply because of the role that they have been put in. So we think about this idea of ministry, of meeting people's needs, something that we're all called to do, but we also recognize there are different roles, and some of those roles, they are more demanding, I guess we could say, in that sense, in a sense related to the financial aspects or the practical aspects, but I want us to pause right there, because here's where things get interesting. You see, again, without trying to make this focused on me or on people who do jobs similar to what I do, if I were to ask you, well then, who gets paid to minister? What kind of people get paid to do ministry? If I were to ask for a show of hands, for example, I don't see anyone, I could be missing someone, who gets a paycheck specifically related to some form of ministry in the church. I'd be the only one to raise my hand, right? That'd be kind of embarrassing. Well, how do we think about that? That's the exception, right? There's this small group of people in terms of Christians as a whole, right? The small group of people who get a paycheck, a literal paycheck from doing some form of ministry, whether it's teaching, whether it's preaching, whether it's some form of mission or counseling or ministry or helping those who are without the necessities of life, whatever the case might be. That's a small segment, right? Very few people actually get paid to minister. And naturally, those people who get paid to minister, they have a responsibility to do the work, to work hard, because they're actually getting paid for it, right? But that's the exception. Most people don't get paid to minister. Brethren, I would submit to you that we're thinking about that all wrong. Completely wrong. Yes, there are some of us who get physical, financial compensation, if you want to call it that. Support is really how I like to describe it, for doing different forms of ministry that take a lot of time, and we're certainly thankful for this opportunity to be able to do that in this way, because it allows us to commit more time than we would otherwise be able to. But all of us get paid to minister. All of us are in paid ministry positions. No, I'm not talking about a paycheck. I'm not talking about someone slipping you cash under the table. Love your enemies, Jesus says. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be sons of the Most High. What is that? Loving your enemies, doing good, lending without expecting anything in return. Isn't that meeting a need? Isn't that ministering to those around us? What does Jesus say? Well, unless you're the paid preacher, unless you're paid in some form of ministry, you won't get a reward. But no, he says everyone who does that will get a reward. It may not be a physical reward, but the physical rewards don't matter in the first place. Aside from a very small portion of the population, most of whom I would argue aren't doing it for the right reasons anyway, how many people do you think go into the field of ministry because they think they're going to get rich off of it? Now, don't get me wrong. The church here is extremely generous to us, has supported us in so many ways. It's been wonderful. But I hope all of you know we're not making $1 million a year. Nor do I ever expect in any context of ministry whatsoever to be making anything close to that. And that's a good thing, because I don't think I want that much money anyway. But you understand the point? Ministry, the ministry that all of us are involved in, it is designed to be compensated, to be rewarded. We are all in paid ministry. The king will say to those on his right hand, this parable that Jesus gives as the sheep and the goats are separated right and left. He says, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Let's say I did get $1 million a year doing what I do. That wouldn't mean anything compared to this. I'd much rather get paid by the words, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father," than any amount of money, any amount of anything that this world can offer. But do you remember why? Why are these individuals told that they are going to be welcomed into the kingdom? As you did it, talking about feeding those who are hungry, caring for those who are in prison, who are sick. As you did that to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Jesus is saying you met a need. You ministered to someone. And that's why you are going to be rewarded with entrance into my kingdom. That's better than any paycheck you could ever get. That's a reward worth working for. That's something that cannot be put in terms of dollars and cents. But I hope we remember the opposite side of that as well. He will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Remember why? I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty and you didn't give me drink. A stranger and you didn't take me in. Naked and clothe me. Sick, you didn't visit me. We could add on to that list, right? He's trying to summarize, but we can keep going. Struggling and you didn't comfort me. In despair, you didn't offer me help. Dealing with temptation, and you chose to look the other way because that could get messy. What does Jesus say? You did not do it to the least of these, so you did not do it to me. Brethren, we do not have the luxury of compartmentalizing ministry within the Lord's church. We are not given the option or the authority to say these people have this job and these people have this job and we're paying them to do all this and therefore they do the work of ministry and no. We all get paid to minister. Different ways, different roles, certainly. It's not a bad thing. That's not unfair. That's how God designed the church. Each of us have different opportunities, different skills, different abilities. But we all get paid. And we also all have the capability of putting that payment in jeopardy if we don't do the job of ministry. If we don't, as even Paul said, fulfill the work of ministry. Because every one of us are surrounded by people in need. Whether that be physical need, emotional need, spiritual need, Every one of us are surrounded by people in need. Every one of us have the opportunity to minister. And the more we look for those opportunities, the more we'll see them. You'll never run out of opportunities if you're looking. But if you decide that that's what others are responsible to do, that's what others get paid to do, you might not get paid. You might not get the reward that is waiting you. So let's think about this differently. Am I going to get paid for my ministry? I have no plans to do this, but perhaps down the road, you never know what might happen. Maybe I'm not working in some form of ministry for the rest of my life, and I mean that in the more technical sense, the way we use it. That doesn't mean my job as a minister is over. There are a lot of things that Liz and I have talked about that we want to do, not because of our specific role here, but because we're Christians. It doesn't matter that we get supported to do specific things. We're going to do those things. I say we, I'm going to do those things. That is the role I've been hired for. Liz is going to do things not because she's been hired, because she's a Christian. We have a job to do. We have needs to meet, all of us together. Will we get that reward? Will God look back on our lives and say, you did it to the least of these. You did it to me. If we can help you this morning in any way, please let us know as we stand and sing together.
Would you be free from your burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in